Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our afternoon keynote session. Please welcome Brigadier General Paul Fredenberg, Executive Vice President, AFCEA International.
All right, we're going to have to liven up the crowd here a little bit today. I guess we all enjoyed our lunch in the new networking lunch format. Yes, no, maybe? All right, good. All right, so we're going to keep the momentum going this afternoon with another great session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Jake Braun. He's the Acting Principal Deputy National Cyber Director. Prior to his current role in the White House Office of the National Cyber Director, Mr. Braun was appointed by President Biden as a senior counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Mr. Braun is also a lecturer and the former executive director of the Cyber Policy Initiative at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He's an accomplished author, penning Democracy in Danger: How Hackers and Activists Exposed Fatal Flaws in the Election System. And he also co-authored 3 award-winning works on election infrastructure cyber vulnerabilities. We also have AFCEA's very own Vice President for Defense, Colonel Mike Black, the U.S. Air Force retired, who's going to facilitate today's conversation. Mike joined AFCEA back in 2022 from the private industry, following a 26-year Air Force career that culminated that he was the commander of White House Communications Agency. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to welcome Mr. Braun and Colonel Black to the stage.
Sir. Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, well, Jake passed the test. Jake did say good afternoon, but we're going to do a redo so I can get a loud and thunderous response back from you guys. Let me know that you're here. I know I have some friends out here, right? Okay. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, I'm honored to facilitate this discussion today. We're kind of rounding out our keynotes and people that are participating in this conference. I'm very fortunate to have the White House here with us today. And, you know, the Office of National Cyber, the director, they coordinate the whole of government approach to implement our national security strategy and policy. And so we're fortunate to have the Jake here. He's the acting principal deputy for National Cyber. And so we're kind of going to get right into things here. Jake, you can tell us a little bit about yourself, but when you go to this first question, you can just tell us who you are and all that. But the first question is really going to be about the strategic vision and policy. So within the office, what is the Office of National Security Cyber Director's overarching vision for national security, let's say in the next 5 years?
Sure. Well, first off, thank you, Mike, for having me today, and thanks for AFCEA for inviting us. Happy to be here, and it sounds like there's a pretty impressive group. You said about 6,000 registrants.
Yes, sir.
Several hundred presenters out there, so that's, you know, we're happy to see that type of ecosystem development in the region. We certainly need it to support all the federal government needs here in cybersecurity. So, as you said, I'm Jake Braun. I'm the acting principal deputy national cyber director in the White House. So our office was created in 2019 by a bipartisan act of Congress to set up an office, a cyber office in the White House that would oversee long-term strategic planning. Our first tasking from the president was to write a national cyber strategy, which we did. And after that was over, He signed it, and then we were on the hook to run an implementation plan, which was what I was brought in to do, was to oversee the implementation of the National Cyber Strategy, which is a 10-year-long plan, but we're into year 2+ of it, so right around your 5-year mark you're asking about. So the strategy really calls for 2 key shifts in how we think about cyber. Number one is that we're trying to shift the burden of cyber from the individual, so, being worried about my father or my 13-year-old son being the single point of failure where if they click on the wrong link, their bank account's going to get drowned or drained, to shifting that burden to the folks who actually have the resources and the know-how to implement good cyber practices, mainly, obviously, the industry that the folks in the industry that build our tech, so the big tech companies. So that's thing one. How do we shift the burden in cyber from the individual to the folks who have the capability to actually bake cyber in on the front end? Thing two, that I'm sure everybody in this room, you wouldn't be at this conference if you didn't understand the second piece of this, which is really incentivizing long-term investments in cybersecurity on the front end of building out our infrastructure and so on, as opposed to doing what I assume most of you in this room have had gainful employment doing for the last 20 or 30 years, which is bolting cyber on after the fact to all of this infrastructure that we've built around the country for the last 100 years or so, and now is trying to put cyber onto it. So those are kind of the 2 big shifts in what we call out in the cyber strategy that are really part of that kind of guide every aspect of our vision for cyber for the country. But the implementation plan, by the way, is dozens and dozens of initiatives that go from everything from global diplomacy around cyber and trying to make sure that the folks on Team Democracy are really rowing in the same direction against those on Team Authoritarian, to making sure that we're going after criminals in cyberspace, and down to more tactical things like zero trust architecture, and kind of everything in between is what we're kind of focused on driving forward with implementation of the strategy every day.
Well, I like those 2 examples of Team Democracy and Team Authoritarian, and then also being able to, I guess, break it down into those 2 key shifts that you talked about. I definitely can relate to the aspect of building a black box after we have got our systems to try to make things talk, and so in putting that investment up front to incentivize that, certainly it helps and makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate that, and I thanks for sharing that, the vision and policy. We're going to delve into something that I just termed coordination and communication. And so with so many federal organizations interdependent on one another, how do you ensure the effective communication and coordination among all of these federal cybersecurity agencies?
Thanks. So one of the main things we're doing, and really we haven't had this before, is one agency or White House office like ourselves that's now up to nearly 100 people, whose sole job is driving federal cohesion on cybersecurity. And really, as I mentioned a minute ago, we do that through implementation of the National Cyber Strategy. Nearly every agency in the federal government has some aspect of cybersecurity tied to their part in the implementation in the National Cyber Strategy. And so we have a whole team who is doing a whole series of Gantt charts, which drives everyone crazy that we are sitting there tracking everything they do, and are following up with interagency calls and everything on a daily basis. And then things escalate as agencies maybe don't hit their goals. They get a call from me, and then maybe Director Coker and so on about hitting them. But I'm not aware of another time in the history of the federal government where we put out a strategy in cybersecurity like this and then had a team this large that was driving implementation of it and cohesion across the federal government on implementing that strategy. And so one example is we workforce is a key part of what we're doing. I know we're going to talk about that later. And we decided, well, it turns out that there's a whole bunch of folks in the federal government who are focused on cyber workforce. And so we're constantly having stakeholders asking us about, well, what resources can the federal government provide to help us, help students or help universities or centers of academic excellence, which I know we have several of in Maryland, or building cyber ecosystems, cyber workforce ecosystems in different municipalities around the country. So our group went and did an inventory of all the programs that support federal cyber workforce development across the country. Everything from scholarships for individual students to grants from NSF and others for state and local governments to build out ecosystems and everything in between. And it turns out there's 109 programs that we found, and I don't even think we found all of them. There's 109 programs across the federal government that support cyber workforce development in one way or another. And so we compiled those, put them on our website, and now when I do meetings with folks, like I was just in Cleveland the other day, the mayor's office in Cleveland, and they're like, how do we do a better job of building out our cyber workforce? Is there anything you can do for us? Instead of doing what the White House normally says, which is like, well, I'll give you a best practice guide, I say, actually, there's 109 programs that you guys can access, and we'll send you a link to the list, and feel free to reach back out to us for any more information on those things. So it's things like that we're doing to really try and move the ball forward in terms of trying to get the different agencies all trying to achieve the same goals.
Oh, good. I'll remind the audience that the opportunity to ask questions here towards the end of this. So make sure you look at the Ask Me TNC cyber at gmail.com. You send a question to there if you got something to ask. Now, Jake, you mentioned cybersecurity ecosystem, and you also mentioned cyber workforce, and I know you touched on both those. So my next two questions are about that. If you want to expand on the cyber ecosystem, how would you best describe the current state of the U.S. Cybersecurity ecosystem? I know you touched a little bit on that, but if you want to amplify anything on that.
Sure. So I think a couple different things. So first off, as some of you may have seen, we put out a congressionally mandated report which is on the cyber posture of the United States just a couple months ago at RSA, or right before RSA. And there we identified kind of 5 key trends. I don't think these will be a huge shock to folks in this room, but they were essentially AI, obviously, threats to critical infrastructure. And by critical infrastructure, remember, we're not just talking about the stuff we used to talk about when we said critical infrastructure and we're thinking about the DIB or the financial industry or whatever. Now we're talking about things like K through 12 education, water utilities, things that 10 years ago most people weren't thinking of when they thought about cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. Also, commercial spyware, the prevalence of commercial spyware being sold, unfortunately, to Team Authoritarian, and not being kept in under the auspices of Team Democracy. The global supply chain, and again, I think we had been, all of us, concerned about global supply chain for a while, but I think now we're seeing that we really need to understand cyber in 2 aspects of the global supply chain. One is the security of the cyber supply chain, so the code and so on that is in the installed base of our IT systems across the country and across the world, but then also for all the physical systems that now have technology as a component to them, where cybersecurity needs to be a concern for the supply chain of even for physical products and services and so on. And then finally, ransomware. Again, it seems obvious to mention ransomware, but again, what we're seeing is what we were worried about with ransomware 5 to 10 years ago is really morphed in the last few years, where actors are doing things that we really didn't envision them doing before, like, again, going after K through 12 education, which you may think, well, who cares if they lock down some schools? But I don't know about your kids, but my kid's entire school is run on IT now. And if the IT's shut down, they can't go to school. or can't engage with the school the way they used to. Or hospitals, we saw attacks during COVID on hospitals and places like that, not to mention, again, water utilities and so on. And so ransomware kind of really has become much more than a nuisance and a real threat. So those kind of key trends that we called out in the posture report is one way I would kind of describe how we're thinking about the ecosystem. The other thing is the ecosystem that I think we are kind of aspiring to build. And so if it starts with the national cyber strategy we put out, as I like to say when I do events like this around the country, strategies from Washington are nice. However, strategies with resources are a heck of a lot better. And so one of our capacities in our office that Congress gave us was really to be able to delve into federal budgets and understand where the cyber dollars are in the federal budget. And the first couple of years, it was really just about kind of the money that's spent to run the federal government. So like what OMB sends to Congress every year. What we've kind of expanded that into over the last few years is really looking at 3 other major investments that the administration has made along with bipartisan acts of Congress. And that's the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL, which really goes to invest in bricks and mortar, roads, bridges, wings of airports, stuff like that. IRA, which is really the move to clean energy in this country, so investing in smart grid, solar panels, wind, et cetera, all that stuff. And then finally, CHIPS and science, which I think folks in this room are probably the most familiar with. And in those bills, there's a few places that we immediately found cyber to be called out. There's grants that go through FEMA that CISA oversees, about $1.2 billion to state and locals for cyber planning grants. Now, the overall price tag of those 3 bills, depending on whose numbers you agree with, are about $1.8 trillion. And what we found that, there might be this $1.2 billion, which doesn't sound like much, but after we really looked into the numbers, cyber is implicit throughout all 3 bills. You can't build a wing of a modern airport without having cyber in it. You certainly can't, or you shouldn't, and they don't anymore, hook up solar panel installations or wind farms to the grid without having cyber be a part of it. Nor do you or should you build an advanced manufacturing plant with CHIPS money without having cyber be a major part of the plant. And so what we're trying to kind of figure out and work with folks like the people in the audience here is how are we taking the goals of the strategy and providing resources to invest in long-term cybersecurity and marrying that up with this once-in-a-generation investment that we're getting into infrastructure in the United States to ensure that companies like the folks in this room who may not see themselves in that bill because they don't think like, oh, I don't do bridges and roads, I don't do windmills and solar panels, I don't do advanced manufacturing plants, start to see themselves in, but gee, I should be on the team that's building the new airport wing because that airport wing needs to have cyber. Right. I should be on the team that's hooking up the new solar panels to the grid because that needs to have cyber in it. And I need to be a part of the team that's building the advanced manufacturing plant because that needs to be cyber secure. So marrying up the strategy with this $1.8 trillion of investment is a way that we're really trying to think about what the cyber ecosystem of the future looks like for us. And again, what will lead into your next question is, strategies are nice. Strategies with resources are better. Strategies without anybody to do the work are kind of irrelevant, and so I think that's where you're going next, so I'll pause on the workforce piece.
Oh yeah, well, that is where I was going to go next on the cyber workforce, but I like the, I guess the cliche or the analogy to, to have the strategy with resources. Many of us that have background in military here at DoD, we clearly understand, the need to have the resources to do that. And also, we're going to get into critical infrastructure too, but I liked how you foot stomped the difference between how we looked at critical infrastructure maybe in the past to now, so where we're talking about K through 12 and water and other things like that. But for cyber workforce, you may have, hit the outer skirts of this. But what initiatives are in place to address the talent shortage, the talent shortage, and how can we better prepare the next generation of cyber professionals?
So thanks. Again, this was truly a key, but this isn't some like throwaway thing we're doing. And I think if you actually look at our statute and the strategy, this workforce piece is very clearly assigned our office. And I think it's because we've been trying to figure out cyber workforce stuff in the federal government for years. And what we've largely had is some great initiatives, but they're kind of like point initiatives to solve a specific problem for a specific agency. And what the powers that be realized was that you need a White House office who is going to actually own this issue. And so because of that, and because, to your point about military kind of way of approaching these problems, we really deliberately thought that having the strategy is nice, but we have to have the resources to put behind it. And again, that means we need to have the human resources to actually implement the strategy with the financial resources that we had. So the very first product we put out after we put out the strategy was our national workforce strategy.
Okay.
And what that called for was a couple different ways of thinking about cyber, and then I'll go into a few tactics that we're using to implement that. So number one is, and this is something that I know people in this room live and breathe every day, which is we can't just rely on those who've been self-selecting into the cyber industry to fill these massive gaps that we have, the 500,000 or so, whoever's number you believe, number of vacancies that are out there. And so that means that we can't just go to the four-year institutions that are pumping out folks with bachelors in cybersecurity and think that's going to solve the problem. Because honestly, look, I'm all for four-year degrees. I have 2 master's degrees. We're not against secondary education. But even if everybody in a cyber program in an undergraduate school today stayed in the program, graduated from that program, and went into cyber, we still wouldn't have enough people.
Right.
And as we all know, people change majors, people don't graduate, and people go into different fields afterwards. So we're definitely going to need more. So one is to really think about how are we expanding the pipeline to be targeting folks from all different walks of life. And maybe that's community college in a rural area. Maybe it's a veterans group. Maybe it's a minority serving institution or whatever. And again, I know folks in this room have been expanding the net of who they're trying to bring into cyber for years now. But we've been really out on the pounding the pavement, the Director Coker and I, trying to ensure that folks in parts of the country that don't have to live and breathe cyber as much as you do in the National Capital Region are thinking that way as well. So thing one, how do we cast a wider net? And then thing two, if we're going to cast this wider net, we can't then just say to everybody, oh, well, you need to come into cyber with the same, via the same on-ramps as the traditional folks who self-selected into cyber at an early age. And so that's where we've really pushed for building out apprenticeship programs, internship programs, hiring people based on skills, not necessarily four-year degrees, and so on, so that those folks, when we cast these wide nets and find somebody, or hopefully large groups of people who can help fill these 500,000 vacancies, that we're finding on-ramps to bring them in that actually are going to ensure that they can get into the field. And so, again, trying to eat our own dog food.
Right.
From the federal government perspective. So what we've done, and you may have seen announcements from us in OPM on this, we are in the process of removing the four-year degree requirement for the 2210 job series, which is basically IT workers. And about 60-70% of cyber jobs fall within that category. Excuse me. And so essentially, we're able to then hire people based on years of experience, certifications, aptitude tests, and so on. And so they're coming up with a range of ways to assess people that isn't just, do you have a BA or not, or a BS. So that's thing one. Thing two is, as everybody in this room I think knows, most of our federal workforce are actually contractors
Right.
in cybersecurity. And that is just a reality, and that's not going to change, I don't think, anytime in the very near future. And we desperately need more civil servants and so on, but the reality is most of our cyber workforce is contractors. And so OMB is in the process, jointly with us, and working with the acquisition community to remove four-year degree requirements where appropriate. And of course, in some cases, you may need a PhD for a particular cyber job, but where appropriate, we're working to remove four-year degree requirements from contracts as well. And again, no one wants a race to the bottom on talent, and so we're working with the acquisition community to identify what other ways would we have PMs, cores, and the contractors be able to assess talent, so we got the appropriate resources on these vehicles. So those are two main initiatives we have going, is removing four-year degree requirements for civil servants and for contractors. Secondly, I know this is a very metrics-driven group. Nobody today could tell you how big the problem is we're trying to solve. I can't tell you how many cyber vacancies there are in the federal government. Nobody can. And so we started an initiative with OPM about 6 to 8 months ago to actually, for the very first time, for the entire federal government, count the number of cyber jobs and figure out how many are filled so we can understand how big our vacancy rate is. That project is supposed to be done very soon, in a matter of weeks, not months. And so being able to actually have a target number for us to hit is important, so we can stretch to be able to hit it. And then finally, to that end, we are launching 3 different cyber hiring sprints this year. One we did back in April. We have 2 more coming up, and those will be both in-person and virtual, so people from all around the country can apply to these jobs, as well as folks who want to show up in person to apply here, and in the event that, or in an effort, of course, to fill these vacancies that we have.
Right. Interesting enough, I mean, in almost every keynote or panel that we've had thus far, there's been a question or a speaker has addressed, the cyber workforce, and various numbers have been thrown out about the vacancy. I appreciate the efforts that are going there about casting a wider net, and then looking at really a person's qualifications as opposed to just a degree to do things. And I think the services are looking at some of that also, and bringing in people at a higher grade than we normally would bring them in because of their experience that they have. And I think that's all another way to look at things. Critical infrastructure. What measures are being implemented to protect our critical infrastructure from cyber threats? I mean, you've touched on critical infrastructure in a couple of answers, but specifically, what measures are being implemented to protect this critical infrastructure?
Sure. So this has been a key focus of Director Coker since he got on board, is really looking at these critical infrastructure sectors that have traditionally not gotten a lot of love from the interagency. So as I mentioned a minute ago, we've been talking about the DIB for, decades at this point. We've been talking about the financial industry for at least the same amount of time. Energy has, in the last 10 years, I think, has got a pretty robust conversation around it. But again, when it comes to K through 12 education or the water industry in general, those two in particular, as well as ag, these are areas or sectors where there really just isn't, because there hasn't needed to be up until now, a robust program to support them, support those critical infrastructure sectors from a cyber perspective. And so we've really started to focus on, knowing that Department of Education is doing a great job with the resources they have, EPA is doing a great job with the resources they have. CISA, of course, has done, yeoman's work on trying to improve our SRMA capabilities federal government-wide. But as a White House office, we're we can kind of look above everything else and kind of focus on areas that really are systemic risks to our society as a whole. So thinking agriculture, schools, and water. We've really tried to hone in our focus there. And so just to take two of them, so for K through 12 education, as you guys know, as folks who pay property taxes and so on, these schools, largely, depending on where they are, in most cases, can barely afford their teachers and their capital investments, much less having to hire a CISO or, buy cyber tools or whatever. And so we've been trying to find, low cost or free solutions that can somewhat up their game from having little to nothing to having something. And so to that end, there's been a few entities, MSISAC being one, and some other private sector entities, Cloudflare and other, who've come out and offered free offerings of scanning tools. PDNS, I think, is one of the acronyms we use. I know there's others, that schools can download for free to, at the very least, be able to scan their systems and see if they're bad guys. Now, look, we realize this isn't a panacea. This wouldn't be enough to protect NSA from, from Russian hackers and so on. But it's certainly better than what exists today for K through 12 education, and it's free, which is kind of the name of the game for a lot of these schools who, once you tell them there's a cost associated, they shut off because they don't have the money for it. So thing one is we're working with the MSISAC and other private sector folks to really drive adoption of some of these free scanning tools that are out there. The other great thing about many of these tools is they don't require an IT staff or a cyber staff to manage them. You kind of like plug it in, it generates, it does the scans, and you're done. Separately, in terms of water, I assume most of the folks in this room, judging from the uniforms I see here, know about Volt Typhoon, but this is something that obviously we're very concerned about. It's one thing for the Russians and Iranian attackers to do some of the things they're doing, but what the Chinese are doing with Volt Typhoon is something that really does get up to the level of White House grand, strategic planning and great power competition framework of thinking on this. They're not having like random hacktivist groups come and deface a water systems website or turn things off and on or otherwise try and mess around. They are deliberately trying not to get caught with what they're doing. The Chinese are pre-positioning on utilities, particularly those that support military installations, to degrade our capability to be able to mobilize in the event of war with China. And we obviously are quite concerned about this. You've seen the NSC and EPA have done a lot in that space. One of the things we're doing very specifically, so kind of like this PDNS, the secure scanning technology that we're trying to help schools download. For water, again, back to BIL, billions of dollars have been appropriated through BIL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, for water utilities to do a whole host of things that frankly have nothing to do with cyber, ripping out lead pipes, removing PFOS, whatever that is. I know it's bad for you, but it's some sort of bad thing in water. But in many of those cases, there's some level of IT spend that is associated with those projects. And what we've identified, again, with our budget analysis authority, is that in a few of the funds that are set aside for water utilities, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund that exists in every state, cyber is not only an allowable, but a highly encouraged expense, expense. So we are going to, our office is working with multiple stakeholders to talk to the utilities and the states that support these utilities that are serving military installations to say, hey, there is funding available for you to use to improve your cyber capabilities. And then separately, back to our workforce mandate, is we have a relatively large workforce team that does workforce strategy and so on, but they also are focused on some pretty specific tactics. And in this case, we're trying to replicate a program that we identified at Texas A&M San Antonio has, where they have a cyber program and a water program. And the students that come out of there have a certificate in both, I guess, cyber and water. But as part of that certificate, they are required to do an internship at a local water utility. Again, most of these utilities are lucky to have an IT person, much less a cyber person, except for the big ones, of course. And so they're providing in-house cyber expertise that otherwise these small utilities, and by the way, nearly all of them that support military installations are small water utilities, are providing them with hands-on expertise that they otherwise would not have. And the two things the water utilities has said to us over and over is, look, we don't have the resources to do cyber. We barely have the resources to rip out all the lead pipes, which, by the way, is an important thing for them to do. I didn't realize how many lead pipes there still were in America. So A, they say we don't have the resources, so we're trying to help them deal with that based on these new funds that are available. And then two, they say, look, even if we had the money, we wouldn't have the workforce to do it. So we're trying to help them address that, knowing that we could give them a bunch of money, but based on where a lot of these places are, they couldn't hire cyber professionals that would work at these places long term because there aren't any in the parts of the country they're in. And so by connecting them with local community colleges and other groups that have apprenticeship programs and internship programs, we're trying to get them the type of hands-on expertise that can do some of the basics in cyber that they need. And so those are two kind of really specific initiatives we have around K through 12 and water. So anyway, happy to answer more questions.
Okay, that's great. We're coming close to end of our time here, and don't know if we have any questions that have come in from the audience. If so, I can hear them. If not, I have a couple in my hip pocket. So Terry, do we have any questions?
We sure do, Mike. And first one, we have a number of attendees in the audience who have noticed Mr. Braun's very colorful socks and are wondering if he's sending a message with them.
So, well, it's funny. So this one actually says WB4A, which my old boss, John Tien, who was the #2 at Homeland Security, used to say to us all the time, which is what's best for America. I wish that most Americans actually knew that, like, senior policymakers in the government actually do sit around in meetings, and when we have a question about what we're supposed to do, like, actually, I know it sounds corny, but are like, well, what's best for America? They like legitimately ask the question. But really the reason I have two different colored socks is because I went to Catholic school growing up, and we had to wear uniforms, and the only thing you could change was your socks. And well, I'll tell Mary, who's laughing at me because she's heard this story too many times. When I was in 7th grade, there was like this 8th grade girl that I was interested in, and all the 8th graders wore crazy socks, and I was trying to one-up them by wearing mismatched socks to get her attention, which worked, by the way. And then I kind of got stuck with it and could never go back, so that's why.
Okay, well, I mean, we got the strategy for that needs resources. We got thing 1 and thing 2. I'm gonna up my sock game. What else do we got out there? I think we have time maybe for one more, Terry.
Absolutely. Mr. Braun, what would you like to see more of from, what would you like to see more of from the software or IT industry as far as cybersecurity?
So two things. You may have seen we put out a paper earlier this year calling for memory-safe programming languages, or the use of memory-safe programming languages. As many of you in this room know, that can really, reduce or remove entire classes of vulnerabilities. Also, that paper called for formal methods, and so that's another area that we're particularly interested in. So those two things, which are kind of part and parcel of one another. And then separately, this point I was making earlier about, we really do want cyber companies to see themselves in this $1.8 trillion of investment in the United States. If you all aren't out there trying to get on these teams that are building the new airport, the new advanced manufacturing plant, the new solar farm connected to the grid, we're going to wind up in a situation where we're bolting cyber on after the fact, which is exactly what we're trying not to do. And look, we know that you're all great Americans who want to do the right thing for the country, we're confident of that. But the other motivation here is it's good for your bottom line. Like there's resources to do this work, and we hope that you, wherever your base of operations is, you spend some BD or sales time trying to go after some of these projects in whatever state you live in, because we need you all to be a part of these projects. So I hope you do that.
Wow. Jake, I appreciate your time this afternoon, and again, I want to emphasize, having the White House here to be a part of this TechNet Cyber is really added a look of the whole of government, and I know you guys do the whole of government thing, but we appreciate you making time for this and really sharing some insights. Several takeaways. I mentioned the strategy without resources is an issue, and there were several references to Thing 1 and Thing 2 in the questions that we went through. So I encourage our folks to take note of that. And then finally, the socks. I think we can't forget the importance of having that. I'll ask you offline about how successful that was for the 8th grade young lady. But,
it was very G-rated, but it was successful.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again. We appreciate it. And I think Paul's going to come up and close us out.
Hey, thanks again, Mr. Braun, for joining us today, representing the White House and the leadership that you're providing in implementing the national cyber strategy. And I'm not going to go hit the sock thing again. We will, but we did learn a little bit more about you personally, so that was good. Thank you and your team for leading and coordinating these critical efforts across our nation. This is very important. In lieu of a speaker gift, AFCEA is going to make a donation to the Fisher House on your behalf. So we thank you for your time here today, and we offer that you could exit the stage. So will I make some other announcements? Ladies and gentlemen, you can see from the highlights on the side of the stage the sessions remaining for this afternoon. There's a wealth of content out there on our exhibit floor. So please take a look at your app for the full schedule and information. Now, and I also want you to remember, since we didn't get to finish yesterday's reception, there will be a reception this afternoon from 3:30 to 5. So please enjoy some refreshments and networking this afternoon. And we are grateful for our drink and ticket supporting partners, Sienna and Comcast Business, as well as our networking reception sponsor partners, Carasoft, Everfox, Juniper Networks, for their generosity. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are going to take a quick break in this theater right now. We're going to reset for our next panel, which is accelerating enhanced capabilities from the tactical edge to the enterprise. This is going to begin at 2 o'clock. It's going to feature representatives from the Navy, the Air Force, the National Guard Bureau, and the DoD CIO. It will be moderated by Lieutenant General retired Bruce Crawford. Thank you, and we'll see you back here in just a few minutes.